Born in 1932, my guest today has been for half a century perhaps the most controversial political figure in Ireland. He's Ruairi Ó Brádaigh, former president of Provisional Sinn Féin and now president of Republican Sinn Féin. For over a generation, he was silenced in this organisation as a result of Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. A lifelong Republican, perhaps the last Fenian. Even today, he is a severe critic of the peace process and the Belfast Agreement. Ruairi Ó Brádaigh, let's start with your childhood and your mother and father. Both of them were involved in the revolutionary events at the turn of into the 20th century. Let's start with your father.
Yes, well, he was a North Longford man from a small farm. He also became a rate collector, and in 1917 he joined the Volunteers and was very active, very proud of the fact that he was marched at Thomas Ashe's funeral in a place of honour, because Thomas Ashe had been sent to jail for a speech he made in Ballinallee, which was my father's battalion area. In 1919, he and another man tackled two armed RIC men with their bare hands, and the result was that both of them were wounded. My father very badly. He was crippled for life and died when I was just 10. He was a big influence on my life. I remember him well. My brother Sean just has two stills in his mind, but I used to have discussions with my father.
Now, your mother also was in the Republican movement. Tell me about her.
That's right. Well, she was born in Belfast, in Clonard Gardens, number 33, at the turn of the century. Her father worked for Belfast Corporation. He sat for an examination, and he became an inspector of public buildings. And when it was found out that he was a nationalist, well, very quickly they added an interview anymore, not just a written exam. But he improved himself. He became headmaster of the technical school in Armagh, and the family moved there. And from that, they moved to Donegal. And by this time, he became the county surveyor or county engineer in Donegal. So my mother had finished in the St. Louis Convent in Monaghan in 1917, and she became OC of Cumanamon in Donegal town at the age of 17.
Now, both of your parents were on what could be called the losing side in the Civil War. They belonged to the defeated Republican side. How fundamentally informing their attitudes was that?
Well, not alone that, but they never went with Fianna Fáil. My father became the chairperson of the County Longford Easter Commemoration Committee and an independent Republican member of Longford County Council from 1934 until his death. And all this was very near to me. For instance, in 1938, the 130th anniversary of the Battle of Ballinamuk was a huge occasion when all sides participated, and my father was the chairperson of the events on the battlefield.
Why did both of your parents not join Fianna Fáil? Because a large part of the Republican movement as it was then, indeed of the IRA of the period, joined De Valera's new movement. Why did they not do that?
Well, they were in the position that while Sinn Féin stood back completely from Fianna Fáil, the IRA encouraged its members to work for Fianna Fáil in the 1932 and 1933 general election. And my parents did that at the behest of the IRA. But like many people, they were very disappointed later, and particularly so since they had helped to install Fianna Fáil in power. I think they felt... my mother told me later that my father's opposition to the Treaty of Surrender, as he would have called it, was very emphatic.
On what basis?
Oh, that it maintained England's grip on Ireland.
Interesting you should call it the Treaty of Surrender.
Yes, that's the way the Republicans looked at it, that it was a surrender.
Even though the fact they would now argue that historically a majority of the Dáil accepted it.
That's true. Briefly, the entire press, there was no radio, no television, the entire press, local and national, were for the treaty. The Catholic hierarchy came out in favour of the treaty. That was outside the movement. But within the movement, the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, canvassed and gave instructions to its members who were TDs to vote for the treaty. And the combination of these two factors, outside and inside the movement, carried the treaty by 7 votes. Otherwise, it would not have been carried.
Talk about Longford, Roscommon, where you came from. I mean, was that traditional Republican territory, and was that largely anti-treaty?
Sean McKeown, who figures in that biography that has been done of me, he was a big influence at the time. But in the 1923 election, Longford Westmeath was one of the smaller number of constituencies where the anti-treatyites had a bigger vote than the treatyites. Roscommon was divided. It had been north and south.
Were there historical reasons for that in terms of the land patents or in terms of the mixture of population or anything, that Longford should have been so anti-treaty?
Yes, there was a tradition right down along, and a lot of the surnames in North Longford are northern. They're Breslin and McKenna, so on. Even my father's people, the folklore tells us that they were driven out of Ulster by the Orangemen. But then there was the 1798 and also the land war. Poor land, especially in North Longford. Better land in South Longford.
I'm thinking of you growing up. You were born, as I said, in 1932, and for 10 years your father had been wounded and was confined to bed. Crippled. So your politics and your position on republicanism is an extension of your relationship with your parents, isn't it?
Well, it may be. But later on I had many conversations with my mother, who was an educated woman.
A very early university graduate. That's
right. Indeed, Sean Cronin wrote when she died that she was a liberated woman of the first Dáil period. I'm very proud of that. But she was very detached when it came to talking about events and so on. And I remember quizzing her about things, and she said, well, now people just don't do things. There is always a reason why things are done, and one must look for the reason, and so on. So I would say that through her and my own reading, that eventually my intellectual conviction as opposed to my emotional conviction.
But was it not a way, you were 10 years of age when your father was buried with full Republican honours and all of the rest. I'm just thinking, was your lifelong belief in politics and Republican politics a way of keeping alive your father?
No, because I think that would be just emotional. It would for a short period, for a couple of years, but it would never have lasted for what it's now 58 years since I joined the movement.
I mean, you've been in many prison cells, you were on hunger strike and so on and so forth. Was he with you in the cells at night? Was he near you? Was the presence of your parents with you at those moments?
Well, in extreme moments, yes.
In what form?
It was inspirational for me.
Could you give me an example?
Well, I had a feeling that I had a lot to live up to. I wasn't going to let that down. And this would be regardless of movements or whatever way they went or anything like that. I was going to maintain my own position as I saw it.
But their position as well?
Yes, but then they were no longer with me. That had stopped. My mother died in 1974. So I had to carry on
Well, you
without them.
very quickly, you went to University College Dublin, you graduated, and very quickly, and we're talking about the 1950s, you joined the IRA. You joined an illegal organisation called the IRA. Why did you do that?
Well, I was interested in the whole situation at the time. One has to realise that the great anti-partition campaign had been
At the end of the 1940s,
at
yes.
the end of the 1940s.
Had raised the whole northern situation
Of course.
in a big way.
And as Boyer Bell says in his definitive history of the IRA, the Secret Army, he says the Leinster House politicians led the people down the garden path of anti-partition to the locked gates of British intransigence. And the Republican movement was waiting on the sidelines to pick up the disenchanted.
So in other words, the anti-partition campaign, which was run largely by most other people, if I remember Conor O'Brien, ended up with young men like you joining the IRA.
Yeah, joined Sinn Féin first, and the following year joined the IRA.
Now, the first time you joined the IRA, did you seriously think about what it involved, that you might have to kill people?
I knew it was an army. I knew it was preparing to fight a war of national liberation, and I realised the consequences of all that. What used to worry me was, would I be well enough trained to acquit myself properly? I wasn't one bit worried about whether there would be a fight or not. I knew, like what the O'Reilly said, if you wind up the clock, it will strike.
But you're what? You're in your early 20s.
Yes.
You're a graduate. You're about a career as a school teacher. Almost everything you've built and achieved is going to be at risk.
That's true, but that's nothing new in Irish history.
But is that to do with the blood that's in you when you're that age?
One felt one had to make one's contribution.
Can we talk about the 50s campaign, the border campaign, because it lasted for 4 years. It was a small piecemeal effort, and both the northern authorities and the southern authorities very quickly put it down. What did it achieve looking back on it now?
Well, if you like, from 1923, there was a short campaign in England in 1939-40, and in the north in 1942, and here was a new generation. So it kept faith with the past, and I suppose it handed on a tradition to the future. That's the minimum. But I think the most important thing was that it trained a cadre of officers who were available when the big heave came in the 1970s.
In other words, it was a prelude to the 1970s, but you couldn't have anticipated there would be a 1970s.
Of course not, but in keeping with the Republican tradition of trying to strike in every generation, it fell into place.
But when you look at your odds in the 1950s, I mean, the Irish government in Dublin with its security forces, the B Specials, the RUC, the British Army, you were opposed by a massive force, and you were going around the fields and the hedges with small arms and handmade explosive. You hadn't a hope of succeeding.
Well, one could point to the Young Irelanders or point to the Fenians and so on. One must always try in this situation. There was the power of internment, which was used, internment without trial, north and south. And towards the end, the Dublin government employed military courts. No jury, no judge.
Well, the IRA employed killing people, no juries and no courts. And we do need to deal with this, because what distinguishes your position from all the other Republicans' positions is that you accept perhaps the inevitability of physical force, of the physical force tradition in Irish politics. Can you still now, at this point in your life, still justify that position? Was that a mistaken position?
No, it wasn't. It was a continuation of the national liberation struggle, and inevitably that happens in the 50s when we had MPs. We would call them TDs because we asked to have them elected to an All-Ireland Parliament. When we had them elected in the north, in Fermanagh, South Tyrone and in Mid-Ulster, they were unseated, and the election set at naught. The constitutional way forward was as good as blocked. When an IRA veteran, Charlie McLennan, stood in South Armagh in the Stormont elections in 1951, he asked to be returned to Leinster House, not Stormont. And he was elected, and of course he went to Leinster House with his anti-partition comrades to find that he wasn't admitted there. So
he wasn't an abstentionist then?
He was an abstentionist from Stormont.
But not from Leinster House?
No.
What is it about the tradition of physical force? What is it, what it does in terms of people's attitudes and in terms of what it can unleash in the society? Because we've now seen, after 30 years, we've now seen, 3,000 people dead.
Yes.
It's an awesome weapon, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And the response, I don't want to spend time sorting out the dead, but the fact that innocent and uninvolved nationalists were targeted as a matter of policy by British-backed loyalist death squads, and over 1,000 of them killed.
But can you and
which was different from the situation in the south in the 20s.
But mustn't you and those in your movement put their hands up too to the people you killed, or were responsible for being killed?
Yes, there were people killed apart from the British forces, and there were over 1,000 members of the British forces killed by the IRA, and that isn't adverted to very often. In the matter of civilians, where that happened accidentally, it was not a matter of policy.
Of course not, but don't you know if you send young men out with guns, all sorts of people are going to get killed? Isn't that inevitable?
Yes, and the big powers, when they bomb from the air, crowded cities, they have massive casualties.
People are always condemning violence. I mean, you're in a fascinating position because you were part of an organisation that used physical force and who spent more time in graveyards than members of the Republican movement. Looking back now on the widows and the orphans and the graveyards and so on and so forth, was it worth it?
Well, it certainly wasn't worth it in terms of the result. And I have often said, well, why, if such a result as the agreement of 1998 was the outcome, why was not the Sunningdale agreement acceptable? It offered more and less was paid for it.
Can I move you on to the early days when the Provisional Republican movement arose out of events in the north? And there has been a popular myth that somehow Fianna Fáil, or elements in Fianna Fáil, or Charles Haughey or something, financed the Provisional IRA. What is the historical fact?
The historical fact is that the Provisional Republican movement was organised by ordinary people out of their own pockets. In 1970, we were all at work, and we were beggared keeping the situation going. There was no income from Fianna Fáil or any other.
Was there any income from Fianna Fáil went elsewhere? Was the money from Fianna Fáil went to the official Republican movement?
There was money from certain funds in Dublin, as the famous £100,000.
The Committee for Relief?
Yes, that was used to support people who were engaged in defensive patrolling of areas in Belfast, the defence committees there. And everyone in those committees, provisional Republicans, the officials, civil rights people, people that weren't associated with any organisation participated in that. And they got support because they had to be up all night. They couldn't work during the day. But that had nothing directly to do with the building of the provisional Republican movement.
Now, when the campaign began in the 1970s, suddenly in a very short period of time, it was almost unimaginable. An enormous campaign was underway, and there were attacks on the British military and the RUC all over the 6 counties in Northern Ireland. Did you ever anticipate that it would happen and grow this quickly, or was it out of control even for people like you?
I would say that all revolution is a leap in the dark. There is a tide in the affairs of men, as the bard says, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. And the people in charge of the military aspect of the movement certainly took the situation by the hair of the head, if you like. There was a feeling abroad, be aware of it yourself, you're a northerner, and Peadar O'Donnell has gone on record as saying that 2 aspects were necessary to deal with situations like this. Number 1 was a fever among the people, if you like, mass support on the ground. And number 2 was a leadership that was prepared to take advantage, to grasp this situation and take advantage of it. And if one had a leadership, no matter how good, without this groundswell of support, it would be useless. Similarly, a groundswell of support without a leadership to catch hold of it and mould it,
you see,
it wouldn't work.
At the time, if I remember, with the provisional IRA statements and your Christmas messages and what was said at voting stands and so forth, was you kept drawing comparisons with Aden, with Cyprus, with the ending of British colonisation, and that if you hit Britain hard enough economically and politically and in terms of physical force, that they would get out. But there was no way that the 6 counties of Northern Ireland were anything like Aden or Kenya or Cyprus. I mean, for a start, the majority of the people there, even though there's an artificial majority, wanted to maintain the British link. So it was an impossible object you were seeking in the beginning, to use physical force.
Yes, well, this situation was carved out very deliberately and knowingly
But looking back
the British government in 1920.
But looking back now, Ruairi Ó Brádaigh, was it a real possibility that physical force could succeed in that situation?
Well, people believed at the time it was. And a considerable, a mass of people felt that this was the continuation of 1916. The anti-colonial struggle throughout the world began on Easter Monday 1916 in Dublin. The people felt that all other means had failed, that it was time to finish.
But surely, if it reached a point of success, so to speak, of the Republican movement, you were then going to end up with potentially a sectarian civil war in Ireland. Because if ever the British had chosen to pull out, then the loyalists would have gone to war. You'd have had an Algerian situation.
Yes, there was that possibility. We were very much aware of Algeria and what happened there and so on. But in the end, the French did get out.
Let me take you to 1972. I mean, remarkably, after 2 years of an IRA campaign, and for other reasons, Stormont was prorogued. Now, that was, looking back now, that was an absolutely defining moment because it was the end of the partition parliament and it ended the complete power of unionism in the north. Westminster was now directly involved. I remember the day it was announcement, it was prorogued, and you made a statement saying an entirely new situation has been created. And quoting, you said, it is an advance on previous British government attitudes, and you called for a cool appraisal of the entire situation. Within moments of that announcement, Sean McStearfan, who apparently was the Chief of Staff of the Provisional IRA, said, it's not enough, the war goes on. Did McStearfan consult with you or with the Army Council or whoever ran the Republican movement, or at that extraordinary historical moment, did he just make the decision on his own bat?
I can't answer that. I know that he didn't consult with me. But we felt for some days before the 24th of March 1972 that Stormont was going to be removed. And that would have given time. And I'm sure that with any sense of responsibility, given that this didn't come out of the blue, that the Army Council must have met and must have considered.
But did that not historically create an entirely new situation?
What it did was it removed the barrier administration between the Irish people and the British government and brought Irish people in revolt into head-on confrontation with the British government in what was looked on in Ireland as an anti-colonial war.
Because in a very short time after that, you were negotiating with the British government, and you were negotiating with the British government, you were secretly meeting with British officials in Derry, isn't that correct?
True, yes.
And you have given the notes of those meetings, I gather, to a university archive, is that correct?
In Galway, yes.
Are you seriously telling me that at that time the British were saying to you, we are going to withdraw?
That was the invitation that was given to us at the time, at Christmas 1974. And it was felt with a great deal of sense, I believe, that this should be explored for what it was worth, and so on, so that a bilateral truce was arranged. The British and those opposed to us on all sides talk about it as a ceasefire, as if it were a unilateral ceasefire, which it was not. There were 3 weeks of negotiation, and the working notes in Galway contain a working account of what went on. And eventually there were 12 points from the British side, and I think 16 from the Republican movement side, or it may have been the opposite. But there was enough agreement to have a bilateral truce, and indeed Peter Taylor of the BBC, who read through the notes completely,
and revealed that Brendan Duddy was one of the important link people in
that's right,
Derry,
the
yes,
intermediary.
Yes.
Yes. But he was forced to admit that it was a bilateral truce. And after that, when that was nailed down, if you like, and the incident centres put in place and so on to monitor the situation, then the political talks followed.
But when you now subsequently look back, you're sitting in Derry 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, negotiating with senior British civil servants and people from the intelligence services. You're talking about British withdrawal. In point of fact, they were ending special status. They were criminalising the war, as you called it. And in a very short period of time, you were fighting an even more difficult situation.
Yes, they were Ulsterising the position.
Were they taking you for a ride?
Well, we know who was taken for a ride.
Were you taken for a ride then?
No. We were exploring the situation, and what they came up with in the end, and it's there on the record, their words, saying that they agreed with us that it had to be a British disengagement from Ireland, that was the end of the situation, had to be. But the point of difference was that their idea of a time scale for doing that differed greatly.
In what
from
sense?
The Republican
10, 20, 30 years?
Well, it wasn't mentioned, but it
was generational?
Yes. It was we used to make jokes and say that these people must be thinking about 50 years or something like that, whereas the Republicans would be thinking of 5 years or less.
So could the present peace process be the same thing dressed up?
I don't think so, because the present
peace
process, so-called, strengthens the British position in Ireland, whereas for the first time large elements of the nationalist population are involved in supporting partition, in supporting British rule, in supporting Stormont, and indeed in administering British rule.
You see, when you talk about British withdrawal and your talks in 1974, it seems absolutely inconceivable that the British government was sitting down with what was an illegal and subversive movement who were involved in violence and killing and so on and so forth, and bombing at the time in Britain, discussing withdrawal, without even consulting with the sovereign government in Dublin. I mean, it seems extraordinary that you imagine for a moment they could be for real, that they weren't not taking you for a ride.
They used to complain, indeed, that the Dublin government were opposed, and that this was a great difficulty in the situation.
Opposed to what?
Opposed to their getting out of Ireland. And it has emerged, indeed, Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald repeats it again, that they...
He says that Harold Wilson was determined to withdraw from Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the message you were getting at the time?
Yes.
But Wilson was cut off by Callaghan and Rees.
Well, so it emerged eventually, but they were discussing disengagement with us.
Now, there were other consequences of that failed ceasefire, and to cut it short, it ended up, in fact, with a group of Northerners rejecting your position, the position of yourself and Daithí O'Connell, and eventually you lost control of the Provisional Republican movement.
Well, let's be very clear about this. Daithí O'Connell and myself are mentioned all the time, but if you look at the people who were present at the fecal talks, the Protestant clergy...
Fecal talks in County Clare, yes, which preceded the...
That's right.
The Derry meetings, yes.
And as Boyer Bell says in his book, listing the people who were there, they were all from the north, excepting O'Connell and myself.
So the same group who subsequently...
So it wasn't a southern leadership. The two prominent people, if you like, the people who were well known, were from the south. But all of the others, Bell says, the heart of the Republican movement, and that's indeed what it was.
Do you think at that time, when you ceased to be president of the movement, when effectively there was a coup d'etat within the movement, do you think at that period of time that they wanted to get rid of you because they wanted to do a political deal?
Well, you're telescoping the situation now. There was a period of years. That was in 1974. 75, and I didn't cease to be president of Sinn Féin until 1983.
Yes.
So there was...
I know there was a period of time, but there was almost status in everything, wasn't there? There was no political movement anywhere. We were locked into a situation of extensive violence and civil unrest.
That's true. The war went on, and it was said, indeed, that the bilateral truce in 75 had damaged the movement. But if it had damaged it, how is it that it was able to carry on for decades after that?
You're saying politically the door would have been open, but perhaps not militarily. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I can't say. I don't know. But I raised that question. Yeah. That's an imponderable.
Because what's also imponderable is that during that period, under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, none of your voices could have been heard. If your voices could have been heard, is it possible that a new situation could have arisen? In other words, did Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act abandon you or trap you that nobody could talk to you?
Well, it made things very difficult. And in my lifetime, I grew up and participated in political endeavour, in elections and all that type of thing. When there was no television, politics weren't on radio at all. and it was a question of getting into the newspapers and using posters and leaflets and churchgate meetings and meetings at fairs and all that type of thing. But then as the situation developed, radio first and then television became terribly important. And if the powers that were at the time were able to, as they were, to cut us off completely, well, then they could say all kinds of things about us, and we had no chance to reply.
Yes, but my memory of the time is that everybody was trying to stop the war. Are you telling me now, all these years later, that if it had come to you and said, let's sit down and talk about how we can stop the war, you'd have been listening?
To say stop the war isn't enough. It's a question of
well, of course,
dealing with the causes of war, because the conflict would return.
Yeah, all of that, yeah.
And indeed, even at the present time, one could say that while British rule remains, that the lesson of history is that there will be further conflict. You and I may not be about to see that, but there it is. The ingredients are there.
Why was the Republican movement taken away from people like you? Why did Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness go against you, particularly on the policy of abstentionism?
Well, let's take it from...
I know it's a huge question.
Take it from the beginning. The Era Nua policy, which was the product of the IRA Army Council originally, and which was...
this notion of having 4 regional parliaments, yes.
That's right, including a 9-county Ulster, where the former Unionists would have a working majority, 5%, 2.5%, somewhere there, but that the Nationalists would be right behind them within reach of power, and then with maximum devolution of power and decision making to local level, or the lowest possible level, there would be a patchwork quilt according to local majorities, so that there would be power sharing, but if you like, natural power sharing according to local majorities, if you like, horizontal power sharing rather than vertical, enforced and unnatural power sharing as we have at the present time.
But was it not a fact that they recognised, and it was the Northerners whose streets were the scene of the fighting, was the Northerners who mostly were burying the dead and going to the prisons? Was it not natural that after 20 years of this campaign, this is 5 times, 6 times as long as the War of Independence, for example, or even the Civil War, was it not natural, was it not reasonable that military force was not going to succeed, that a political deal had to be done? Wasn't that staring everybody in the face?
Yes, well, first of all, the timescale. The colonial wars in places like Vietnam and Angola and so on went on for 30 years and more. Now, if it was felt, and if the point were reached, and I don't believe it was reached, if the point were reached where it was considered that military force had failed, well then the honourable thing to do was to stop. That was done before. It was done.
Wasn't that what they did?
In the 20s, it was done.
Wasn't that what the peace process was about?
Ah, yes, but the peace process, or as indeed people who think like me call it a surrender process, it meant cementing British rule in position. It wasn't just stopping the war, as happened on previous occasions in 1923 and 1945 and 1962. There was an honourable way to deal with that situation.
But you say cementing British rule. You could say that there are now members of the IRA Army Council in the government of Northern Ireland.
Well, the Reverend Paisley had his own version of that 3 weeks ago on the BBC when he said, and I can quote him, he said, "I have smashed the Provost. Their main plank I have taken from them. Their main plank was that they didn't accept the British government in Ireland. Now They are part of the British government in Ireland, and they cannot call themselves true Republicans if at the same time they are actively engaged in the British government in Ireland.
But how is it the British government when it's Irish people passing laws and governing Irish people in Ireland?
Yes, but they are just a sub-office of Westminster. They are not the government as such. They are.
But is that not an enormous achievement?
A glorified county council.
Yes, but for the first time since perhaps the Gaelic chieftains in the 17th century, that nationalists in the north have political and economic power for the first time ever.
They have, if you like, civil rights, and all of this was not about civil rights. They have civil rights under British rule, and I don't believe for one moment that to achieve civil rights that a military campaign be engaged in.
But what right do they not have now that they should have?
The British government should be detached from Ireland, and the whole of Ireland come together.
But if you speak to somebody across the border, somebody from Newry or somebody in Derry, an Irish person, a nationalist, what right has he not got that a person in, say, Dundalk or Monaghan, as a result of the Belfast Agreement?
Well, on Easter Monday, I am not advocating the like, on Easter Monday in Derry, when people tried to parade to Republican graves, they were stopped by the RUC stroke PSNI. The control and the say-so is ultimately with the British government. Now, for instance, I mean, I could make a long list of this. The St. Andrews Agreement said there should be an Irish Language Act, that the Irish language should be recognised by Stormont. And what is the position? When this arose last autumn, the two unionist parties came together and used their majority to stop this, and used disgraceful language, saying that it was a bog language, that it was the language of leprechauns, and so on. So the majority in Stormont rules in that regard. Furthermore, the one Irish language newspaper, Lá Nua, which is a daily paper and a great achievement, finds itself cut off from any type of official advertising, and makes it very difficult to see how it will manage in the future. And indeed, Aer Lingus, who moved their route from Shannon to Heathrow, London Heathrow, to Belfast, yes, now they can no longer make announcements in Irish as they enter Belfast or they leave Belfast.
That was Aer Lingus's decision.
Yes, true. But this is the creeping tide of Anglicisation.
But at the same time,
going into any other city in the world, they would use English, they would use the language of the city they are approaching, and they would use the Irish language. But not in the second city in Ireland.
But to get to the structure of what was created in the Belfast Agreement, in terms of how it was structured and created, there's nothing there to stop the irresistible rise of nationalist power, is there, within the structures, if the votes are there?
Yes, we'll see that.
And the Government of Ireland Act is gone.
Yeah, but will it? Will they be given time? Will they still be nationalists? You mentioned an increasing vote, but will that be a nationalist vote? Or will it be some type of West British vote?
Are you saying Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness are becoming West Brits?
In effect, yes.
In what sense?
They are participating and they are becoming, merging with the whole situation, with the whole status quo. And given time, they are now recognising the British police in Ireland, and they're encouraging young people to join it, and so on. It's only a matter of time. They lay wreaths at the cenotaph for the British soldiers who have died, including those who died fighting the Irish liberation movement.
Well, there's another historical moment I want to bring you back to. In 1972, there was a meeting between John Hume and Daithí O'Connell, in other words, between the SDLP and Provisional Sinn Féin, in Donegal in 1972. And Hume told O'Connell it was time to cash the cheque the Republican movement had accumulated, that the SDLP and the best of the Republican movement could make an irresistible force in Irish politics. O'Connell said no. 2 years later, John Hume sent you a message asking for a meeting. You consulted with colleagues and refused. 1972. Looking back now, maybe you should have gone to that meeting?
Well, no, if the objective was to split the Republican movement and merge part of it with the SDLP, no way.
You think that was the objective?
Well, he said so. Well, what he said to O'Connell. Those are his words, and Joe O'Neill was present on that occasion.
And do you think that's what has subsequently happened to Sinn Féin now, to the Adams and McGuinness?
Yes, to Provisional Sinn Féin, yes.
They have been split and divided?
Yes, and they're being absorbed into the status quo.
Because historically speaking, the Republican movement has been splitting since the very beginning. It split over the treaty, split in the 1930s, split in the 40s, split in the 50s, split in the 60s and the 70s, and again in the 80s.
Yes, but there's...
I mean, you've lost two Republican movements.
And the generation before me lost two Republican movements.
What does that say? What does that say?
It says that elements of the liberation movement have given up the struggle and have sought a constitutional way forward, which means to work within the British system. And there were elements of the Young Irelanders who did that in the 1850s. There were elements of the Fenians who went into the British Parliament. There were, and so on. You can go right down along the line.
So your position
but it's always the question every time is between continuing the struggle against British rule or trying to placate the British and trying to get reform and trying to gradually improve the situation. And John Redmond tried it, of course, and so on, and ended up sending an awful lot of young Irish people to their deaths in very tragic circumstances.
Because historically you have also opposed the European Union, and yet that has completely altered the nature of our relationship, our political relationship with Britain. So in a sense, is there not a contradiction in your positions there?
Yes, well, that raises an almighty question as to the whole question of the European Union and
that is what? What is that question, Ruairi Ó Brádaigh? What is that question?
That question is what the no people, if you like, regard as another form of imperialism, that the power is being gradually taken away from the national parliaments.
From local democracy, yeah.
And centralised in a super state, and that bit by bit by bit it's happening over the years, and it also is leading towards a type of European army and so on, which would not only be engaged in defence of the Union, but then we're told for 2,500 miles outside the Union, and then we find that it seems to extend to almost anywhere in the world. So there's another superpower to rival the United States being built.
So looking back now and reflecting on a long, long life in Irish politics, what do you think your major contribution has been, and what have you stood for at the end of all of this?
And I suppose I have stood for a historical position and a continuation of the national liberation struggle, and against these processes, if you like, the Americanization of Shannon, support the anti-war movement, so on. But there were sometimes, I think about it, and the Fenians and their oath, which was a soldier's oath to Ireland, to the Irish Republic, now virtually established, and to obey orders. And at the present stage of my life, I'm reminded of Robert Frost, when he wrote about passing by woods on a snowy evening. And he said there were things to do, there are all kinds of things I would like to do. I'm very attached to the Irish language, as you can see. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep.
Ruairi Ó Brádaigh, thank you very much.